I'm Jennifer Fraser, and I'm excited to talk to Jonathan Baynes today, the CEO of the Alberta Prosperity Projects, as we have a great conversation around actively creating the change we want to see in Alberta. Hi, Jonathan. How are you today?
I'm good, Jennifer. How are you?
I'm very good. For those of you who don't know Jonathan, he is a strategic leader with specific expertise in business transformation across multiple sectors in South Africa, the UK, and now Canada. Jonathan has had a colorful background evolving from education to becoming the change director on Europe's largest policing change program, where he gained a deep understanding on how big government takes control of your life through slow and steady bait and switch communication strategies and regulations. After immigrating to Canada, he continued his strategic work in various government agencies and universities in BC and Alberta. Having spent the first part of his career centralizing for big government, he is determined to spend the rest of his life decentralizing power and government mechanisms to ensure the power is brought back to the people. He sees the all too familiar handiwork of unelected bureaucrats and their media partners fully activated in Canada, and he is determined to prevent their ultimate plan from unfolding. Well, with that, Jonathan, what is the Alberta Prosperity Project and how is it formed?
So the Alberta Prosperity Project is a registered society. It's an educational society. It's not a part of a political party. Its goal is to educate Albertans around the importance of sovereignty, and sovereignty includes exercising your self-determination within Canada, or if the federal government doesn't support that, without Canada. And so we're sort of leveraging ourselves for both options and trying to educate Albertans on how that happens. Yeah, one of the first groups, I think, that have a real plan on how to get to that point of sovereignty. So that's what we do.
For sure. And so with that, when was the Alberta Prosperity Project formed? And what was the driving factor for that formation?
Yeah, I wasn't really involved in the founding. I moved to Alberta last year from BC. So I joined the Alberta Prosperity Project towards the end of the year as just volunteering and getting involved. It had started in the COVID years. I don't want to speak for folk like Dr. Dennis Modry, who are the real founders. But I've got a feeling that there's been an independence movement for a long, long time within Alberta. Alberta has never been treated well by Eastern Canada or West or Central Canada. And so a lot of those movements have sort of come and gone, but very few of them have actually spent time looking at the constitutional framework as to how would that actually happen, and what's the actual plan to get to a point where Alberta can protect the interests of Albertans and build an economy and help create an environment that people can prosper. So it came out of, I think, years of other movements not quite achieving or moving forward. Yeah, that gets reiterated. Pretty much everyone I've spoken to since we've been in Alberta absolutely would love to see Alberta be more sovereign, but doesn't believe that it's ever possible. And so our challenge is not so much trying to convince people, it's just trying to help people understand that there is actually a roadmap towards sovereignty and towards independence. And we're being more strategic as to how we get there. So not a straightforward answer, but I wasn't here at the beginning, but I had followed the Alberta Prosperity Project from when I was in BC. And I recognized a group that had a plan and also an understanding of how big government works and the nature of that struggle, I guess. And so, yeah, I just plugged in.
For sure. And so that brings us back to your history too. In Europe, you spoke about being part of the change director for the big policing change. So how does your background complement what the Alberta Prosperity Project is doing?
Yeah, so a lot of folk don't really understand how governments introduce change, or how did we get to where we are like today? And a lot of people are focused on some of the I would almost say distractive things that are happening, but don't understand how on earth did we get here? How on earth did Canada become a place where people were not allowed to travel, people were forced to wear masks, people were, you could argue they were forced to be injected or lose their jobs. How on earth did Canada become a place where that was allowed to happen? And so my background is in implementing change, and so in the world of change management, it is a science. You can study this. There is science around human behavior and how do large population groups make decisions. It's often not what we think it is. Sometimes people think we make decisions based on what makes the most sense, but I think 80% of our decisions are made based on how we feel, our emotions, and we then justify those decisions with our intellect, which is like 20%. And I know 80-20 is a rough thing that everyone uses, but that is roughly how that works. We make our decisions based on our emotions and our fears, or our appetites, and then we justify them. So the question is, how do we create an environment where, if it's a significant change, where people actually ask for the change that we were planning for them to have in the first place? So we have to sort of backward engineer the way people work. So if I create a scenario, and countries have done this for hundreds of years in battle, is you create a false flag scenario, you create an enemy, and then you tell a story about that enemy, about how awful they are, how they're threatening your family and everything else. And eventually it doesn't take long before a group of people may suddenly have an enemy who theoretically would never have been an enemy had it not been for the stories that we told, that a government normally tells about them. And then on the back of that enemy poses a real threat, and the government on the back of that narrative can introduce all sorts of draconian measures, like emergency acts, policing, sort of battles and wars. A lot of battles and wars have been fought off the back of things that never really happened. And so, just as an example, I use this often. When I was working with the police, they were introducing all the CCTV cameras into London. The program had been struggling to gain traction for about 7 years because people were saying, well, we don't want a surveillance state. Why would we want that in London? And prior to me coming on, the team that I came in after had come up with the idea of, said, well, instead of using the word CCTV cameras, we've had some safety issues in London, let's call them safety cameras. And so when you change the language and you use something as simple as a shift in language from safety to CCTV, which is sort of a piece of technology, and safety now is directly connected to our feeling of security or fear. Well, wasn't I safe before? Well, oh, these cameras are going to help me feel safe. Everyone wants to be safe. So now suddenly, from a point of trying to sell something to a population, the population is actually asking for that. You could see the same thing with the rollout of the COVID pandemic. And when you see information that's presented that creates fear, that is also presented outside of context. So, for example, when you see a media presenting COVID deaths, well, those deaths may well have been happening anyway through flu. But when you see statistics presented outside of context, you're pretty clear there's a pretext, and they're trying to force you to think of something, or they're wanting to push an emotional reaction, because at the end of the day, they're aware that the emotional reaction creates a desire for a population to have some sort of protection. And who do they go to for protection? Is, well, normally the government. So unfortunately, a lot of these communication strategies to implement large-scale change are rolled out, initiated by the governments, and then managed through government communication departments, and who have the media on board. And the media is motivated largely by money or profit incentive and clickbait. And so whatever's going to get the most headlines, it used to be that whatever's going to generate the most advertising revenue, but I think it's sort of fallen into sort of more an ideological trap. Mm-hmm. You get the media on your side to keep reinforcing the same narrative. So that, that may be overly detailed on how that change program, how change works. So when I look at then how do we get to a point of sovereignty? How, like, I have to work from I backward engineer that. So I'm thinking, well, let's say we have a scenario where we have a referendum on independence. What is the average Albertan going to be thinking at when they're about to make a check? Do we want to be independent or not? Well, most Albertans will be saying, am I going to feel safer being protected by Alberta, within Alberta, or do I feel safer being protected by a federal government that's thousands of miles away? And for some people who have thought a lot about that, they would understand the mechanics of, yeah, we can have our own police, we can have our own military, we can have our own economy, we can have our own trade corridors, we can have alliances to be able to connect to the ports in Vancouver, and they can transport their goods through here. So they understand all the details of how that works. And so they wouldn't have any worries about the decision. But a lot of Albertans would never have thought through that detail and are going to think, oh my goodness, how on earth are we going to ever survive without Canada? And that fear is going to get in the way of people making decisions. So when we now backward engineer that and we say, well, how do we educate Albertans to be able to fully understand the implications of that sort of decision? You know, there are a number of stepping stones or building blocks that we need to help people understand. So, for example, helping people understand that, you know, they're 100 times better off having their own pension managed within Alberta than they are by a central government that, you know, we're not even sure what's left of that pension, to be quite frank, you know. And so just as one example, that once people have that, once people maybe have, we're collecting tax, we've got our own policing, which we largely, you could argue, we largely have anyway, and increasingly have through the sheriff's departments and that sort of thing. People need to understand that all those mechanisms that make a nation sustainable and strong and prosperous, we largely already have. And so now when we look at the Alberta Prosperity Project, wanting to try to educate as many people as possible, that's what we need to educate them about, is not trying to convince people of anything, but just try to explain that roadmap and how do we get to that point. And I think it's not difficult for people to start putting those pieces of the puzzle. And then, you know, we have on our website a bunch of information around the constitutional way that we can become independent through the Clarity Act. And there's a whole bunch of other things and considerations. We've got a team developing, well, there's a bigger team developing a Bill of Rights for Alberta that really, you know, just could be implemented any day and would be awesome. So that's sort of where my perspective comes in, is how do we educate people so that as and when we get to the point of having a referendum on independence, it's not if, it is a when. You know, the unfair treatment Alberta is getting is not going to, people are, you know, I think Canadians are really patient, but that patience is going to run out. So when we get to that point, we want to make sure people are as informed as possible. So that's all we're going to try and do.
That makes sense. So, how do you reach people who have been generally apathetic or who hate politics or who are even just overwhelmed and they don't know what to do or who to turn to or who to trust because we've created such a divisive society?
Yeah, I think, you know, if you look at the movement has grown massively through these emergency things like COVID. Where a lot of people really, their eyes become open to realizing, oh my goodness, this world that I thought, this government that I trusted, none of that is real. And so that's a real crisis for a lot of people. You know, the mental health of a lot of people just wears on them. And you know, it's exhausting because, you know, you've grown up believing the world is one way. And it's actually, and you find out it's not. That's quite a it's a bit like having a midlife crisis throughout your life. You know, and so one of the challenges I see within these sorts of movements is that it's a bit like you have a lot of early adopters, who've joined the dots very quickly, and for them it's just obvious. But for a lot of people, there's a lot of emotion, a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, just in general at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so the question is, you know, I think it's a great question: is who becomes a trusted voice? Well, the challenge we've got is the government in Canada anyway. If you live outside of Canada, this is quite horrendous. The fact that you have a government-sponsored media sort of removes any, you know, any authority that a media agency had for being an honest broker of knowledge is sort of removed when its government is paying for it. That's a huge conflict. It's amazing that is the way that is. But because they have the ears and the eyeballs of most people, unfortunately, a lot of people are believing the story that they get told. I have firsthand experience. We grew up in apartheid South Africa, and in apartheid South Africa, they also sponsored the media. It was a government-sponsored media, and the media did the same thing as the sponsored media here. You have all these interviews of people who you invite around at the meeting, and you have these things, and you feel like you're getting an objective view of the world. But in the meantime, you're getting a very contained and controlled presentation of the world as the government would, wants you to see that. And so I had my moment of in my early 20s realizing, well, late teens, early 20s, realizing that the world that I thought was real wasn't actually the way it was. And then you have to deal with that. And I remember very clearly I say a lot of people, a huge amount of people who had been privileged by the previous system. They didn't want to recognize the fact that it wasn't good, it wasn't fair, it wasn't necessarily everyone's reality. And so that is a crisis, but it's an important one if it brings you into touch with reality. Canada, I think, is we're still in that process. I think First Nation folk who I spend a lot of time working for are a lot more aware of some of the realities because they've experienced this, for a long period of time. The injustices of a big government, and I think conservative people who often are on the independent side have often negated some of the injustices with First Nation people, but now actually experiencing those very same injustices themselves. And so I think some of our biggest allies will be First Nations, who are also working hard to get towards sovereignty and functional sovereignty, without the overlords of the Indian Act and without the federal overlords like controlling everything. So I think we live in probably one of the most exciting times in history, when you've got independent nations who have such unique gifts and perspectives and resources and knowledge, that they should be sovereign. I don't even remember what the question was, Jennifer, so I apologize.
That's okay. It was something to the line of how do we help people figure out who to trust, right? Like that's, I think people become paralyzed. There's so many people doing so many different things, and nobody knows who to trust. And the government has created that themselves. Like we've got cancel culture, and like everything is horrendous at the moment. We have doctors speaking out who are being canceled themselves.
Yeah, I spoke to our doctor during COVID, and I said, are you aware of the danger of these things? And he said, yeah, but he says we're under the sort of College of Physicians and whatever scientists or whatever. So they're under college that they're not allowed to actually give advice that's counter or contrary to the advice of the College of Physicians and Doctors. And I thought, wow, like I'm trusting you as my doctor, and yet you don't have the freedom to actually say what you believe is true. And I thought, wow, that's not a good system, and I think that for me is really challenging. At the end of the day, you thought you would trust your doctor, you thought you would trust the media, you used to trust the government, and then you very quickly realize that's not helpful. And so I think the movement, we should really be probably have I don't know how to explain this apart from using a word that's not very political, which is we should be a little bit more compassionate and loving. So people don't really care how much you know until they know how much you care. And so as a movement, we want to be that trusted voice that genuinely cares about, the sovereignty and prosperity and health and well-being of everyone. And so often we've been sucked into becoming protesters on the side of the street. And a lot of people don't identify with protesting and wouldn't really want to be part of that, and would be cautious around joining a group that's been sort of pushed to the side. And so I think, conversations like this, I think with yourself, Jennifer, I think this is a very reasonable, open conversation, without anyone screaming or arguing about points. It's really just saying, look, how do we create a healthy life where we can be really honest and truthful, but also be unafraid, and hopefully if people who have understood and come to an awareness of the reality, if we can, rather than try to preach it and shove it down people's throats, if we can just be compassionate and realize actually there was a time when we didn't understand these things either, and just be a little bit more compassionate in our conversations, I think I don't know, for me sounds like a better world and a better conversation to be having.
Absolutely. I mean, it's kind of the driving force behind this summit is really opening up that conversation and helping people understand the importance of debate and being able to have civil conversations, that we don't have to agree on everything, but where do we come together on the things we do agree on. And so from the Alberta Prosperities Project, what is the big problem that we are trying to overcome?
I think, and so just going back to first principles, is I think every human being is endowed with the privilege of being sovereign and self-determining in their own lives, with the ability to experience the consequences of their actions, whether good or bad. And so that's sort of what sovereignty is. Sovereignty is our ability to use our gifts, perspectives, and abilities for the benefit of ourselves and our families and our communities as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when you have government stopping you doing that, that's a problem.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the problem we're trying to address. And so at the moment, the big problem is that we have a federal government that has, like never before, started imposing on the ability of Albertans to be self-determining. Albertans elect provincial leaders, but those provincial leaders have their hands tied behind their back most of the time, because the federal government is imposing their own regulations and laws. And when they don't do it from the top down, they fairly insipidly start funding municipal city councils and governments to sort of undermine what the elected officials are supposed to be doing in the province. So, we have a real battle in that our ability to make sensible decisions for the benefit of people living in our jurisdiction is being, taken away. And it's been taken away for quite a long period of time, just one piece at a time, and I think that's the problem. So that's the challenge, that we're trying to get back to a place where humans can be free, with the ability to be prosperous for the benefit of everyone. That for me is huge. And I actually don't care what political party helps us make that happen. I think that if you're a political party that is not supporting sovereignty, what are you doing? Like, you should go work for the other government. If you're like, you should, that's your role. You're supposed to be there to defend and look after and protect the interests of your citizens. And if you're not doing that, what are you doing? So yeah, that's why for me, it's weird that, and I'm going off your question a little bit, but in this world, everyone's been forced into being left or right, liberal or conservative, or left wing, right wing, and it's such a unhelpful way to frame our reality. Like I never really historically considered myself conservative, but you've got an ideological group that has become so extreme that anyone who isn't with them is now conservative. And it's like, well, I didn't think I was conservative until recently. And so it's crazy. But yeah, this is where we are.
I know it's funny to me where conservatism is your right wing extremist because you value traditional family values and you just want a great upbringing for your children. And like, I'm like, whoa,
Yeah,
okay.
that used to be liberal, huh? That used to be a liberal idea, but it was like, yeah, it's crazy.
It is. But that brings me to, this whole ideology of diversity, which is supposed to be inclusive, but seems to do the exact opposites. So do you want to speak to that?
I would love to speak to that. And this is one of my big passions. I have a belief system that is based on this idea of unconditional love. So, and that means that whether we agree with someone, like someone, or whatever, our role, because we have this all-loving, like, creator, we're supposed to be loving people with absolute unconditionally. Now, that doesn't mean we don't protect ourselves from people who do bad things, and that it just means that we recognize in others just their sort of God-ordained beauty and perspective and gifts, and in the bundle of humanity that they are. And so every time we start to try to categorize humanity, we're reducing humanity. So if you try to categorize me as a white male, well, I'm not really white. Like, that's white. So that category doesn't really, and I'm actually from Africa anyway. So am I African? Well, not really, because my couple of generations ago, my family came from Europe, which is why I've got a color skin I have. And the story that I went through to get to Africa, to get to Canada, is quite different. So when you start categorizing people on the basis of color, it's just such an arbitrary, superficial description. You've got curly hair, I've got straight hair. Does it mean we've got, like, so what? Like, so, people's, yeah. And so, the word inclusion is awesome. It's a great word. We should include everyone. But the problem is the way that the politicians have used the word inclusive is actually meaning exclusive. And so normally you can see that. You see that with the current government leaders now, is normally what they say is you sort of just, they normally mean the actual opposite. Like in universities, I was sitting within a university and they were rolling out this sort of policy on academic freedom. And I remember asking the question, I said, well, this policy sounds like less freedom than before the policy on academic freedom. Like, there used to be more freedom before your policy on academic freedom. So, like, what's happening, And so, the language is completely twisted around, and that for me is, it's intentionally divisive. And unfortunately, politicians are really good at creating division and discontent, because they have to define as sharply as possible who their tribe is, because that tribe is who's going to hopefully vote for them. And so everyone who's not part of that tribe then has to become the enemy in some way, shape, or form. And if they're an enemy that makes a lot of sense, well, then we've got to cancel them and find a way for them not to be heard. But that's my problem with politicians. It's just so tribal, and it's not helpful. It doesn't make a strong country. I think, and so as I look at this whole thing, government should be reduced in its role and its function significantly. It shouldn't be playing such an all-encompassing role in our lives. Because when you ask the question about inclusivity, if you think back to growing up, I don't know what kids were like in your neighborhood. I had a kid at school, actually my best friend in primary school, I won't say his name. Like, we were sort of the class jokers, as it were, but we separated when he went to a different high school. And I saw him at a sports day when we were playing their school at sport, and he was dressing up in women's clothes. Now, this is back in the 1980s. And I thought, like, he's still my friend. I still love him. I still care for him. But he just started doing some things that I thought, wow, like, that's a bit weird. Like, to me, it was weird. But it didn't mean he was less human. And so, yeah, so for me, it's sort of, life is what it was. But, and you accepted him. Not everyone accepted him, but not everyone accepted me. So it just, like, now we've made a battle of everything. And you have, I'll give a story. So this is a quick one. Is I was invited. There was a group in BC that was sponsored by actually George Soros money, Open Foundation, to get together all the HR departments of all the major companies in this town, with the mandate of trying to implement inclusivity policies within HR, and they wanted everyone to have their pronouns, he, she, they, them, and they were literally wanting to change the whole thing. And at the time, I was working for a First Nation, so I had our HR manager and myself, and we went along to this meeting. And so now they're trying to create all this language around diversity and inclusion, and the conversation was interesting because it was along the lines of every time you try to label us, you're trying to divide us. And so, from one of the elders that has said, he had told me, when I first joined the First Nation, I went there and I was trying to be politically correct and use the right words and say, it's a privilege to work for the Silks people, and using the right names. And he says, we're not Silks, we're Scalech. And I thought, oh crap, I've used the wrong word. I apologize. I didn't know there were another group of people here. And so afterwards I said, I'm really sorry, I must have used the wrong word. But he said, so I said, who is Scalech? Because they said, no, Scalech means human. And he said, every time people come along and they want to try to say that we're indigenous or we're white or we're this tribe or that tribe, every time they do that in our history, they've done that to divide us. And he said, we're Scalech, we're human. And so we identify as human, and don't try to separate us on any other category, because then you're dividing us. And he just, I found an incredibly sort of spiritually awakening, in the sense I realized, I've been sucked into this whole Western view of dividing everything by these categories. And in the meantime, he's saying, no, we don't want to divide stuff. We see things as combined and joined, and we want to connect things again and make them whole. And I thought, man alive, this is the sort of message that we need to hear more of. And that was really transformational for me. So when I talk about inclusion, I think we should have HR policies that are focused on our shared humanity, and any attempts to further divide is what shouldn't be allowed. And, we have laws in place to treat people well, so we should treat people well. So, yeah, I just think everyone has been sucked into this ideology of division that just doesn't help anyone.
I agree. And it seems people are literally sucked into it, and they're taking a side or a stance on something that doesn't even make any sense, because we are all humans. So on that, is the Alberta Prosperity Project, is there a goal to build physical connection as well as virtual connection? Right, I believe we need physical connection.
Yeah, we're actually in the process of shifting. We've had a number of physical chapters. We've got a bunch of them spread across the province.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where people meet up. They get together, they meet monthly, and they just talk about issues. We're looking to have 87 of those that coincide with the political writings. And then so that it allows for smaller groups just to plug and connect together.
Mm-hmm.
So I've just started, I'm running an event in Okotoks once a month. I'm starting an event in Calgary once a month. And we're just meeting in a pub or somewhere. And we're trying to create a format where, every month someone will share their story. Like, what was their awakening story, as it were?
Mm-hmm.
Like, why are they in the conversation, and where are they in the conversation? Just to hear a real human being. And then I'll get because I'll be leading the groups, I'll give a sort of 20-minute sort of discussion on some of the things that we're facing and what we're looking at, and just helping describe the movement to people. And then there'll be a bunch of projects that people can volunteer with and get involved in through their weeks. And, we want to encourage everyone to be inviting people to, have a coffee and talk about that. And, our call to actions are pretty simple. We've got a website that we've restructured. So we have a bunch of learning content on there, with interviews, podcasts from anyone and everyone. We can put this podcast up there. This would be great. We want to get people to go visit that. And then, if you've got a group of people, just, have a look at a podcast and have a chat about it, and see, we are we're trying to make it as easy as possible for people to plug into the network. So you don't have to, but if people are able to support us with like $5 a month as a donation, that helps us fund the movement and start paying for events and that sort of thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then, we've got an awesome newsletter, which is really well structured. So it's not a long meandering newsletter. It's really just a very short heading and a summary of a lot of key articles that are happening, as part of the conversation that we're involved in. So that comes out once a week. That's free. Anyone can subscribe to that. So that's awesome. And so I find that a hugely valuable. I don't have a lot of time to digest like huge amounts of social media and content. So that for me is like it's a quick hit, and I can see what I'm interested in diving down and deeper. So yeah, so that's what we're trying to make those connections. And then the other side of that is we are trying to create a movement, not an institution. So that means that there's going to be a lot of projects that people sort of birth that they're passionate about, that, so one of the ladies, she's starting a project called I Am Albertan, and she really wants to start helping paint the picture of what is good for Alberta, and paint a beautiful vision and picture, because so many people have been fighting and protesting, and I'm quite tired, to be honest. And so she's really wanting to help motivate people to get excited about what is Alberta, what could Alberta be, and just do that in a very visual way. So, that's not Alberta Prosperity Project, but she's someone who we connect with. So we'll sort of bless that project and support it and encourage that. And there's another lady, she's really good on some of the details. So she's created the Sway Project, which is if people want to write letters to government for issues. She put a whole lot of resources and templates and that sort of thing online. And that's not necessarily, once again, it's not the Alberta Prosperity Project, but it's definitely part of the movement. So that's how we wanted to connect with people, is not everyone has to be doing exactly the same thing. Some people want to go knocking on doors. That's great. But not everyone does. Some people are happier inviting friends to a meeting. And, at the meeting, we try and encourage, we like to have it at a pub because we want to have food and drink and community. We don't want just to be like heads. We want it to be hearts as well. So yeah, we're working hard on doing that. And yeah, just shifting the message from being one of protesting to one of a plan, So yeah, let's see how it goes.
Well, and I think that's important because even, I kind of started protesting way back in my day, but after, the truckers convoy, it kind of fizzled for me. I was like, okay, now I don't have to do this anymore. But then I didn't know what I wanted to do because, and I think that's where some people are. And so it's nice to hear that there's different projects that people can be involved in, because I think a lot of people feel like there's too much to do and they don't know, but it's like you just have to do one thing. And so I don't know if you want to speak more to that to help encourage people that it's so important to just get involved in some capacity.
Yeah. And I think that's a good point, because um some people are not completely clear on the word sovereignty, but for me that's the one thing. So I could speak to a trans person and I still want them to be sovereign. I want them to be self-determining. I want them to be, and I want to support whatever they can be, whoever, and they've been made to be someone important and special. I can speak to someone who's a farmer, has been in rural Alberta for the rest of his life, and I can have the same aspiration and desire around their sovereignty. For me, it's just having that conversation, and not everyone has to be wanting separation. Some people can't say, no, we want to be sovereign, but we want to stay in Canada. That's fine. We more than welcome a lot of those people under our tent, as it were, or under our umbrella. But the conversation around sovereignty should apply to everyone.
Mm-hmm.
And so we've mapped out, we said, look, we have a challenge, and our battle at the moment is with a government that's taking away our sovereignty and our freedom pretty much every day. And they're taking away our money. They're taking away pretty much everything that we rely on to be sovereign. And that's a problem, and so we need to have strong people who can fight back, but thoughtful people who have a plan. I think that's what we're hoping to see.
For sure. I mean, and that's what it feels like. The government is pillaging from our pockets. And so we really need a strong economic solution. And it seems that the Alberta Prosperity Project has that roadmap. So I don't know if you can speak to that as well.
Yeah. So if you think of the government loves it when, if things fall apart, everyone becomes more reliant on the government, and the government who are elected, that creates the complete uh, breeding ground for Machiavellian type leaders who are purely focused on on control and power. So and they do that one step at a time. And so they take away they take away your money and your tax. Well, what we want to do is that creates harm to Albertans. So we want to make the case for this government within the Alberta Sovereignty Act to start collecting tax, and so that the Alberta government could, rather than having all the money plundered, we can say, no, this is money that we should be looking after for Albertans, and yeah, we can share with you whatever, but we need to be able to be in the controlling seat for that. So we'd really want to see that happen. The Alberta pension is another plan. So we want to see the pension be managed by Alberta, so that we have some very clear, transparent accountability. We don't want it managed thousands of miles away. And at the moment, one of the things they're struggling to even do is just get us the information which should be available to hand if you got the money. So that's very concerning. And so you can imagine, if we have that, I think the ability for the federal government to direct the RCMP, I think, is problematic. Especially as a province that is as successful as Alberta becomes more successful, when you have your policing service, and I do call it a service because it is there intended to serve the people rather than force or control the people. But as the policing service starts getting direction from people who are a million miles away, how is that reflective of what the citizens of Alberta need? So we want to have that under the jurisdiction of the province, and then you want to have municipalities that are working together for the benefit of Albertans. You want to have a telecoms infrastructure that supports all of Alberta and rural Albertans, and doesn't prejudice and treat unfairly rural Albertans who don't have access to internet that should be sort of a basic right nowadays. And so the roadmap is, let's make sure we get as many of these pieces of the puzzle for within the existing. Danielle Smith introduced the Alberta Sovereignty Act within the United Canada. So we want to have that as fully implemented as possible before the next election. And there's no reason why she can't do a lot of that. And a lot of that's just good common sense governance. So we really want to get behind that, because I think what she's introduced is brilliant. We understand that there are people who would be trying to sabotage that at every stop. And so we want to support her and encourage her to just move that thing forward, and let her know that, look, she's not doing that by herself. I think it's tough for politicians if they, leaders are quite easily become martyrs, so we need to let them know, look, we're supporting you, but you need to be serving the people. And as long as you're serving the people and continue in the way that you started, you've got a huge support base behind you. One of the other reasons I came to Alberta from BC was I was waiting to see that Danielle Smith won the election. Now, I'm not a UCP member, but she's what I call it. It's just a strong leader who really cares about her people, and she's smart, really smart. And when I see the media completely gunning for her, and I see the sort of attacks at her, I'm realizing, oh, she's obviously stepping on the right toes. So that for me is like almost a reinforcement that she's doing the right thing. So that's what I'd like to see. We get the full implementation of the Alberta Sovereignty Act. And then I think in the next election, what I'd like to see are politicians who are willing to say, yeah, we want to put a proposal on the table for a referendum on independence. So that should come from the politicians. And so we wanting to get involved we wanting to educate our members and supporters and everyone to get involved in politics, so that they can really shape policy and shape the future of Alberta. We do have an ongoing petition to see if people are able to sign up to support a referendum on independence. So that itself is not a referendum; it's a petition. It's gathering signatures towards a petition that will call for a referendum on independence. And then, we have a number of other petitions that we're looking to get signed, and those petitions just really help provide a voice and numbers to government, for like things like the Alberta Pension Plan and others. So we have those petitions available on our website. We encourage people to go and sign. And then at some point in the future, we'll work with a bunch of other groups and collate all the signatures and then present that to government.
Which I think is fantastic. And it will give you a good assessment of how many supporters there are. And so for those people who really just don't know where to turn or what to do, is there any advice you can give them?
Yeah, I would love to see them at a meeting and just come and chat in person. That would be my preference. Like I far prefer speaking to people in person. So if they go to the website and look at our events, we post all our events on our website. So it's albertaprosperityproject.com. Go along to an event and just introduce yourself and just start connecting, and there'll be lots of opportunity. We encourage everyone to volunteer where they can. There's lots of things to do. And just start becoming part of the conversation and part of the community and help shape things the way you can. There's a lot of Facebook groups, so they're very active Facebook groups. So go into Facebook and ideally find one in your area that you can plug in with, and yeah, just get involved if you're comfortable in that space. Yeah, but we're trying to encourage everyone to, we're giving all the resources online. We're really encouraging people just to get a few friends together, and try to start reconnecting in communities. Like go to a coffee shop, go to a pub, go to wherever, and just have this as a topic of conversation. 3 takeaways. Can we support the movement? Can we subscribe to the newsletter? And are we willing to sign one of the petitions? I think we can all do that if we wanted to, and it's quite a light, easy conversation. It doesn't, but it just it gives people something practical to do to help move things forward.
For sure. And what about those people who don't talk politics and don't talk religion? How do we get them having these difficult conversations again that are
Well, yeah,
difficult?
I know. I actually I encounter some folk like that. Oh, we don't do anything about politics. Well, you're paying tax. That in a sense that is an illusion. You're completely affected by politics, whether you like it or not. So it's not. It's sort of what's affecting you. Like if like so. Well, I can't believe like we're struggling since we're going to pay all this extra tax with carbon tax or whatever it is. And just having a conversation around a coffee, like what are your thoughts around what we can do about it? And so let people come up with the answer, because there's not a lot of answers. The answer is we've got to find a way to change government so that government serves the people. And I'd love to hear another solution. You can not pay tax, but then that's going to be a pain in the neck, because then they're going to chase you for that. So yeah, and the question is, well, how do you change government? How do you change politics? Because a lot of people don't believe it's possible. Well, in Canada, they don't believe it's possible, because Canada's had a very stable government for such a long period of time until recently. But a lot of immigrants, people like myself, have come through periods where we've seen government change overnight. So it is completely possible. And so, yeah, a lot of immigrants like myself, and I was chatting to a group from the Philippines, and they're saying, Jonathan, yeah, we share the same values, but we don't. Our cultures, and you can't generalize, but we actually don't like to speak against government, or we don't like to challenge government, or we don't like to challenge authority, because that's a cultural value. And so, the challenge is finding a way to do that. And there's good ways to do that. Not everyone has to be protesting. I'm not a protester by heart, like, because I understand how the political system works, and I know that politicians are largely unaffected by a protest. Like, I want to understand how we're going to change government. So what we're doing is I'm saying, well, I would rather make sure that I join a constituency association, make sure that we select a candidate that I know is good and can trust and is going to represent us regardless of any other sort of meddling. And then if we all do that across every political riding, well, hey, now you've suddenly got a government that is actually there because of you, and now can start serving you as the people and the citizens who put them into power, which is sort of what it should be. Government, I think, has got away for such a long period of time of, being elected by maybe 50% of the population who voted, and then now suddenly thinking they have carte blanche to do whatever they want to do without any accountability or transparency. So I think the opportunity to get involved in the constituency association is an easy one to start. They're desperately looking for volunteers all the time. And then just start plugging in, join a board and start having an opinion and sharing your opinion. And I tell you what, since social media and sort of the real challenge to community, I do see that volunteers start building a community amongst themselves as they volunteer. It's easier to build relationships and friendships when you're working alongside each other sometimes than it is just arbitrarily, So I just think, all the lonely people should be joining committees and start getting out there and having an opinion and having interesting or awkward conversations. And respect the views and where other people are at. Not everyone is likes or is comfortable having conversations about difficult things. My religion. Actually my main studies in theology. That's my background, and I was a youth pastor for a period of time. But I don't necessarily think religion, my faith, in my opinion, should have been the end of all religion. So I come from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and so for me, I prefer not to have a religious conversation. And so for me, because I don't think that's what the intent ever was. Religion is often regarded as a conduit between humanity and God. But for me, my view on that reality is that there is nothing separating us from God. Right now. So there is God within us. And that for me was taught. It's, that's what Paul taught, Christ in us. And so for me, that's a conversation. Like, what is God doing in your life? What is this, like, how is the Spirit moving your life, and what do you feel, or what do you think? And I don't need to have a religious conversation or convince anyone to join a team, which is such a sad dilution of spiritual reality. It's the last thing. You look outside. We blessed to live in the countryside, and I look outside and I'm thinking, man, this creator who created this beautiful creation, do you think he's waiting for people to sign up and join a team and a club or a tribe? Like, really? So I don't feel the pressure to have that, even though I have a very deep faith. And I think my view is everything is spiritual. I don't think spirit is separate from physical. So I think, yeah, it's really just trying to acknowledge that reality in us, which I think is then we just have moments, and sometimes good, sometimes we have trials, but then we come through the trials, and yeah, I think there's hope.
I think there is hope, and I think that's just it, right? It's that disconnect from self, that disconnect from God, that is creating the disconnection to each other. And so we have to come back to that self, to that God, to reconnect with each other. And when we do that, that's the community and connection that we're building. And so on that note, do you have any final words on what the Alberta Prosperity Project ultimately wants to achieve? I mean, I know that we're trying to get to that sovereignty, but just some final thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I guess the question would be, what if we achieve sovereignty and Alberta is now completely sovereign? What is the place for the Alberta Prosperity Project?
Yeah.
I think there would be a place. I think for me, we would continuously be looking to make sure that government is as close to the people as possible. So you need a strong Alberta provincial government to break the ties of this federal government in overreach. But once you've done that, then I think the principle kicks into place again, is that we need to make sure that the people within Alberta are the freest people ever. And, that's at a municipal level, at deregulating stuff so that people are as free as ever. And I think that for me is hopefully the next iteration of the movement, so that we can continue that process of becoming more prosperous and free. I do have I do have a heart for other nations. There's a lot of nations around that are struggling with, you could call it this sort of global overreaching colonial government that we have right now.
Mhm.
And there's a strong movement towards independence of individual nations. I love it when I see a First Nation, for example, asserting their sovereignty. And I think there's nations like this around the world that are really suffering,
Mhm.
primarily post World War II, when a lot of these big countries are forced into one, because really they were forced in there by some colonial country somewhere else. And I'm really excited by the fact that we could end up with a world, and I'm hoping for a world where we have a lot more and a lot smaller nations that are reflective of the people within those nations. So for me, that's, I think that for me is a world that I think would be awesome.
That I think that's beautiful, and I think ultimately that's what we need. We need more nations and smaller government, and so that you're really governing just your community essentially,
Yeah.
and so that there can be less government, because right now there's so much bureaucracy, and we need to do something about that, and that's what you guys are all about. And so I thank you so much for being with me today and talking about what you guys are doing and your own personal thoughts on that too. So thank you so much.
Jennifer, thank you so much. I think just the broadness of this conversation itself is I think it's huge. I think this is very much what's needed at this time. So I think your response to the calling inside you is awesome. I think it's great.
I appreciate that so much. Thank you, Jonathan.